Josh Duggar, one of the stars of the Christian reality TV show 19 Kids and Counting, recently apologized after reports surfaced that he molested minors, including family members, when he was a young teen. The news has sparked lots of conversation on the issue of child sexual abuse. Joining us today with his insights is Boz Chavijan. He is the founder of Grace, a Christian nonprofit that consults with faith organizations on this issue of child sexual abuse. Chavijan is also a former prosecutor who has worked in this area. Boz, thanks so much for joining us.
Thank you, Heather. Good to be here.
This issue of child sexual abuse is, of course, so complicated when it happens between family members. What should parents do when they suspect it among siblings, and at what point should they go to authorities?
Yeah, that's a great question. First and foremost, don't ignore it. I think sometimes parents, because the possibility is such a grave thing to even think about, they prefer to ignore it and pretend that perhaps it's not what they suspect. So number one, don't ignore it. Number two, you need to understand, and parents have to understand the difference between sort of normal experimental behavior between two pre-adolescent children who are around the same age. And that can be learned through a lot of, expertise that's out there of what's within the normal range. There's a big difference between that and a pre-adolescent child who is abusing a younger sibling, or a teenage sibling who's abusing a younger sibling. And so understanding the differences and distinctives between abuse and what we would call sort of quote unquote normal experimentation for young children at that age. And if parents say, well, I just don't know, then don't stop with that. Go find out. And that can be done one of two ways, I think. Number one, to speak with a child psychologist to find out, is this behavior within normal limits with regard to that age appropriateness, or is this behavior really something much more concerning? And if you don't have the answer from a child psychologist in the area, then when in doubt, contact the authorities and they'll let you know. I always tell folks, Heather, when in doubt, contact the authorities, because we can't afford to doubt in these situations because the consequences are too grave.
All right, and that leads to a question that I think, of course, you can understand parents would be fearful about, is what would happen to my child if I think my child is a perpetrator. What are the legal consequences for a child, for a minor who has initiated sexual abuse?
Well, keep in mind that we all have to understand that the sexual abuse of a child by an adult or a teenager is a crime. So we don't treat it differently simply because the person happens to be, 15 or 16 or 30. You treat it the same way. It's a crime. But I would say this, Heather, this is something that's really important for parents to understand, is that there have been some studies out there that have shown that the younger a person is who receives treatment for sexual abuse, and I mean as a perpetrator, the younger and sooner we can get that person help and treatment, substantive treatment, the greater likelihood is that they won't reoffend. So what I share with parents is there's a benefit, twofold benefit, to reporting that child, as difficult as it will be, to law enforcement. Number one, it shows and establishes to the child that this behavior is absolutely and incredibly grave and unacceptable. Number two, it places the child in getting the best help through the best resources available in the community. That is the window of opportunity for that child, that young perpetrator, to get the help they need. Because if they don't get help as a young person or as a teenager, strong likelihood is that they will never get help, and they'll probably end up reoffending and probably spend much of the rest of their life in prison.
All right. And let's talk about the victims. Of course, it seems like they're often neglected in conversations on abuse. But what is the best way in a family setting where there has been abuse to protect, siblings who've been abused going forward?
Yeah, Heather, that is such a difficult topic when it's siblings, because as a parent, you love your children, or so at least supposed to love your children equally. And so you have this tension that just tears parents apart on what to do. And I would say this: care for that victim. That victim child needs to become the priority. So oftentimes we're so focused on the perpetrator and trying to get them help, or trying to understand if they're really truly repentant, that we we don't address the victims. And so if your child has been victimized, whether it's by a sibling or a stranger or anybody else, your focus needs to be on getting them help. And getting them help is not just going to a couple counseling sessions. It's going to seek out a trained trauma therapist to begin helping and serving that child and how they're processing that abuse, because abuse by a sibling encounters so many other complex dynamics that don't oftentimes exist in other forms of abuse. The sooner, again, that child can get help, number one, they know that mom and dad are their biggest advocates and that they love them. And number two, that they can learn how to process that abuse in a really healthy way as they move forward with life.
Boz, I'm wondering how, as a society, how should we handle, how should we treat people who, as children, have been abusers? You know, when we have adults who have been sexual offenders, they're on a list. But what about someone who was abused as a child? Does that need to go forward with them in their adult life, and everyone need to know, or what are the parameters?
Well, that's an ongoing debate within amongst experts in this area. One side of the debate says that these kids have an opportunity to be rehabilitated. So do we chain them around with this title for the rest of their life? The other side says, you know, once you've sexually abused a child, there's always that possibility that you can reoffend. And so I don't, you know, I think that that's a good debate to have and a healthy debate to have. I think what's important to understand is going back to the priority needs to be victims and vulnerable children. So if it means protecting our children by notifying other individuals without getting into detail, because some states actually prohibit you from disclosing the identity of a juvenile sex offender. So you have to, A, know the law, so you're not violating the law. But number two, ask yourself, what is the best way to protect the victims? I think oftentimes, Heather, we spend most of our time thinking about what's the best way to protect the reputation of this young offender. And we often, by doing that, which is not a bad question to ask, but by doing that, we oftentimes fail to really ask the more central question. And that is, how do we protect the vulnerable people around this person? And so I think that that's something that every church community and every family needs to be discussing. And with the heart of saying, what's the best way to protect the vulnerable? That's the priority. Second to that is the reputation of this child. Again, I think if you report this offense to law enforcement and the system requires this offender to get the help that they need from trained professionals, there's a much greater likelihood as you move forward that that particular person will not be as great a danger to those around them. Does that mean that we ignore the fact that that person has victimized others in the past? No. We still always have to be vigilant in protecting the most vulnerable, but it certainly is going to be helpful for everybody involved to get that person help, less likelihood of reoffending, and establishing a protection around those who've been victimized.
All right, a lot to think about. Boz, thank you so much for your time.
Thanks, Heather.